these are some serious spending reforms that they've put through, which is a weird combination because here they went into it with a surplus. We all know it's an election season and we were expecting a whole bunch of spending, but I actually wasn't expecting this amount of fiscal discipline.
Hey, everyone. It's Franco Terrazzano holding down the fort in the swamp of the north. I'm with Chris Sims, the Alberta director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. We're fighting for lower taxes, less waste, more accountable government. And hey, guess what? My friend, Miss Simmer, was out in Edmonton recently, and she was smiling. In Edmonton, of all places, she was giddy. Now, Simmer, you were in Edmonton for the budget. Why were you smiling in Edmonton? What's going on?
Because we actually had an awesome budget, and it was the first time I can ever remember in my adult life being at a budget, and it's a good news story. So number one, right off the top, folks, listeners, taxpayers, we got a bunch of rules put through, or at least promised to be put through. Some of them we've been fighting for since like the 1990s. Like I think Mariah Carey was topping the charts. I don't even know if I was Boys were a thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe not. So, I think you were watching Sesame Street at the time when we were arguing that the Alberta government should hold its spending increases to the rate of inflation and population growth. And guess what? They said they're going to do it. So yeah, we got a really good budget out of this from Premier Danielle Smith and her government. So let's get into it a little bit here. So she had a really nice problem, right? She was walking into this budget with about a $12-ish billion surplus, give or take on the end. That's largely due, of course, to our blessing of natural resources. So our oil and gas revenues. So that meant they could spend more on like the shiny objects like education, healthcare, the stuff that people say we need to spend more money on. And they're leading up to an election. So all that said, they are spending more. But Franco, these strong rules are some major rules. Like I just said, the tying spending to inflation and the balanced budget legislation. That was really cool to see.
Okay, well, you can't just leave me like that saying balanced budget legislation was cool to see and not give me the details, Simmer. So why don't you really break down what is actually happening when we talk about the balanced budget law in Alberta?
For sure. So they're proposing, we haven't seen the details yet because they haven't tabled the thing yet in the legislature, but they're going to this spring before the writ drops. So keep in mind, folks, we are facing a spring election sometime here in Alberta. So what they're going to do, they say, is pass a law saying that the Alberta government must balance the budget. They must, outside of times of emergencies. Now, there's the fine print. What qualifies as an emergency, right? Like probably the price of oil bottoming out or aliens landing in Lacombe. Like those are probably the emergencies they're talking about, but we'll have to see. So that's really good to hear. I also am curious to see if they have any stick required there because we're always talking about carrots and sticks. So are there going to be any financial penalties, for example, if the government actually blows the budget and goes into deficit outside of an emergency? So in British Columbia, for example, they used to have pretty decent balanced budget legislation. And whenever they would go into deficit, cabinet ministers, including the premier, would get a 10% pay cut. So like a kick in the pants. That was nice to see. So hopefully we'll see that again here too.
You know, it's really good to see Alberta becoming the pace car again for fiscal responsibility and really the guardrails to protect taxpayer, because you can hear politicians of any political stripe. They're good at talking a good game, especially when they're singing for supper at the doors. But what you need is these types of laws, these types of rules in place to handcuff politicians when those special interest groups come cap in hand. Now, it's great to hear about the balanced budget law in Alberta, but Chris, we do know that Alberta is still in debt. So why don't you break down some of the other rules around how they must go about paying down the debt?
Yeah, that was a big one. I must say our boss, Scott Hennig, president of the CTF, you might have seen him on an episode with Grover Norquist on this show. He actually went with me to the legislature to help out because it's a big lockup and there's a lot of moving parts. And I had never been to the Edmonton Ledge before. He was grinning during the budget presentation. It's the happiest I've seen him be with a room full of politicians and bureaucrats. And that's largely because they're tackling the debt, or at least they're promising to do so. So about this time last year, the provincial debt was in the mid $90 billion mark, give or take. Now, after this budget presentation, it's in the mid $70 billion mark. That's a huge difference. And that's, of course, largely in part because the Smith government put down historically the biggest payment down on the debt in the past 12 months. Thump. And they promised to keep on putting surplus cash down on the debt. So that's really important to see. That's a big reduction in the debt. The problem here is because there's still so much debt and because the interest rate is going up, our debt servicing costs, what normal people would call like, a credit card or interest bill on the debt, is still about the same, Franco. It was around $2.6 billion for the year. But here's the dedication. They came out with a big promise. They said, hey, 50%, at least 50% of our surplus cash now must go down on the debt.
That's big.
The rest of it's got, yeah, right? So the rest of it's got strings attached too. So not only do you have to put at least 50% of the surplus down on the debt, but the rest of it has got to go into the Heritage Savings Trust account or go to one-time spending that doesn't increase overall spending.
Okay, speaking of increasing overall spending, before you're heading into lockup, we were on the phone talking about this, that, and the other thing, but we're also saying we were worried that there was going to be a big spending budget heading into an election, right? We're worried about that. We see that time and again from politicians. But what we were really worried about was also spending for years to come higher and higher and higher and higher. And we were talking about the need, not just for balanced budget legislation, but the need to rein in that ever increasing spending in the future. Now, Chris, it kind of seems like the government is doing that.
Yeah, it sounds like they've sobered up. I know when you were Alberta director here, we were seeing spending increases and it was frustrating. And quite often we'll get into what they often call the roller coaster. They'll get a surplus and it's like, woo, party time. And then everybody lines up with cap in hand. Everybody wants more money. And then they wind up spending per capita more here in Alberta than they do in their peer provinces. And so we're like, we got to put a restrictor on that. How are we going to do that? Let's restrain spending with good disciplinary rules. Well, they said, yeah, we're going to take your word for it. We're going to listen. They listened and they said all future spending increases must be tied to population growth and inflation. Get this, from the year previous. So that's even more restrictive because then they're dealing with the actual number. We're not going to be dealing with bureaucrats in the finance department imagining or projecting what the inflation rate or the population growth rate is going to be and going, oh, oopsie, how could have we known? We were super wrong. And then your budget's all screwed up. No, they're going to set it back on the year previous. I heard Premier Smith mention that to a group of chambers of commerce a couple of days ago. So these are some serious spending reforms that they've put through, which is a weird combination because here they went into it with a surplus. We all know it's an election season and we were expecting a whole bunch of spending, but I actually wasn't expecting this amount of fiscal discipline. In fact, Scott Hennig mentioned that Premier Klein, the late former Premier Ralph Klein, had committed to 75% of surplus going down on the debt back in 1998, 1999. And that's largely what helped him keep that promise and eventually make Alberta debt-free and raise that sign above his head.
Yeah, back in the summer of 2004, he had the paid in full sign. I know many of our listeners, especially in Alberta, will remember those times fondly. Now, when we're talking about these spending limitations, like this is something, folks, that the CTF has been pushing for like the early 90s. Okay. Yeah. And these spending limits in conjunction with the balanced budget legislation is really top notch guardrails. But Chris, I think what most of our listeners are probably going to be thinking now is, OK, sounds good. We love to hear all this stuff. But the big catch is it's a promise. Politicians are prone to breaking promises. So like, how would you give the pushback there?
Great question. So there's many ways that we can hold politicians to their promises. And we get it that there's promises. We get it. It's silly season, as they say in the United States. It's election season. So they're going to say a lot of things. But they've said it. That's out loud with their face. It's on print. It's on camera. We were there. Everybody covered it. They're on the hook here for these provinces. And so say Premier Smith is reelected and it's her government and they start playing around with the books and they're not keeping these promises. We will do massive email campaigns. We will do petitions. I might chase her in a costume that looks like Pinocchio. Like
she'll do it.
There's all sorts. Yeah, I will. So there's all sorts of methods that we have. both very firm and serious, and basically akin to public shaming that will keep them on board. In fact, it was during the scrum in the rotunda where they have, for folks who haven't been to it, it's quite a neat thing to see in the rotundas of these legislatures after these budget presentations. It's just a huge mass of media. So there's camera people everywhere, people running around with microphones, there's lights set up, and they did a big scrum with us at the Taxpayers Federation. And one of the ladies from Canadian Press said, oh, well, what other power do we have to hold them to their promises other than public ridicule? And I said, well, we're pretty good at public ridicule. And they all laughed. So we will hold them to their promises. And then if there's another person who happens to be premier, we're going to hold them to hopefully these same promises as well. Because no matter who's in power in Edmonton, it's all the same taxpayers here in Alberta. And we're the ones having to pay it. So we're going to stick to wanting to see the debt paid down, to see the budget balanced, and to see these spending restrictions.
Yeah. And I'll just remind people, like, we have seen in other provinces, yes, like it is an argument and valid one that a politician can just rip up these types of guardrails. Well, we've seen politicians punished for doing that. And I would say, particularly in Alberta, Albertans, I think, really have a sense of how important these fiscal guardrails are. I mean, one of the most important protections in probably in Canadian history for taxpayers, if I can be so bold, is the Taxpayer Protection Act in Alberta. It was brought in around 1995. And of course, our listeners will know fondly that it means you cannot put in a provincial sales tax in the beautiful province of Alberta without first going to the voters through a referendum. That was brought, like I said, 1995. To this day, it's saving taxpayers billions and billions of dollars. So these types of protections really do matter. They're really important. Our supporters have been pushing for this for decades, I guess, now. So it's good to see the Alberta government bring it in. Chris, before we let you go, let's just provide an overview of exactly the guardrails that were introduced in this budget.
For sure. Number one, balanced budget legislation. They're not allowed to go into deficit outside of a massive emergency. We'll figure out what those emergencies are, and we're going to hold them to it. Number two, paying down the debt big time. 50% at least of surplus cash must now go down on the debt. The rest of it has got to go into savings or one-time spending that isn't crazy. And number three, this is a huge one, tying all future spending increases to the rate of inflation and population growth from year previous. Those are three major spending restrictions that this government has just put on itself. It's basically like watching a horse walk up to a yoke and stick it over its own neck and saying, all right, man, I'll pull. They've committed to it.
So, folks, you might be in the rest of Canada here outside of Alberta wondering, why are we doing a podcast episode just talking about the Alberta budget? And let me tell you why. Because when politicians are saying, hey, what do you want to see in the budget? What you have to do now is say, first, balance the budget, then put your head on a swivel and look at what Alberta's doing, okay? Because once you balance the budget, these are great fiscal guardrails to put in to protect taxpayers, not just today, but for years to come. Okay, so that's the importance of this conversation. Chris, thanks for coming on the show today, and great job keeping these politicians in line.